The fog hung thick over London, concealing secrets that had festered for years. A golden watch, once a symbol of honour, became the key to unraveling a deadly conspiracy, its ticking a reminder of the dark forces at play. With lives at stake, and a curse whispered in the shadows. Nothing is as it seems in this twisted tale of betrayal. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's get started. It was upon one of those grey November mornings in which the London fog does not merely descend but embeds itself within the very walls of Baker Street that I found myself once again sharing the quiet of our sitting room with my singular friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Outside, the lamplighters moved as phantoms through the gloom, their flickering torches barely penetrating the dense atmosphere that hung in damp sheets about the street below. The fire within our hearth gave off a gentle crackle, though even its warmth seemed to struggle against the sullen weight of the day. Holmes sat motionless in his chair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp gaze fixed upon the coals as though drawing from them some abstraction known only to himself. I had attempted conversation on 2 occasions, both met with absent murmurs, and so had taken to the morning paper in silence. There was, in the air, that peculiar stillness which often presaged the arrival of a visitor, a subtle anticipation, as though the very walls of the place were listening for a knock. The knock, when it came, was sharp and uncertain. 2 quick raps, followed by a pause, and then a third, as if by afterthought. Holmes did not move, but his eyes lifted and met mine with a glimmer of interest. "Enter," he called, and the door creaked open upon a young man, no older than 30, whose manner betrayed both anxiety and hesitation. He stepped into the room with the air of one who has arrived at a place both feared and yet urgently needed. His clothing was modest but neat, the cuffs slightly frayed, the shoes clean but well worn. In his right hand he clutched a golden pocket watch, which he seemed to be handling more out of nervous compulsion than any intention of consulting the time. I noted how his thumb grazed its casing again and again, as though seeking some comfort from its presence. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice tight. "My name is Sherlock Holmes," my friend replied calmly. "And this is my associate, Dr. Watson. Please, be seated. You appear to bring with you more than just the London air." The young man lowered himself into the chair opposite Holmes, his gaze darting between us with the hunted look of one unsure whether he has entered a sanctuary or a trap. He opened his mouth to speak, but Holmes lifted a finger gently. "Before you utter a word, sir," Holmes said, "allow me to acquaint you with a few particulars." The man blinked. "You are the nephew of a military man recently deceased," Holmes began. "You are employed, perhaps unhappily, in some capacity involving legal documentation, most likely a solicitor's clerk. You are left-handed, suffer from mild insomnia, and you are presently in some distress over an object that was recently returned to you under questionable circumstances. All this, I surmise, is tied to the very item you now hold in your hand." The man's lips parted slightly, but no words emerged. Holmes leaned forward and extended a palm. "May I?" Silently, the man handed over the golden watch. Holmes turned it delicately, as though it were a delicate specimen beneath a lens. "The wear on the left side of the casing," he murmured, "indicates it is retrieved frequently with the left hand. The discoloration about the chainring suggests anxious handling. The back bears a residue of some mild acid, a chemical cleaning agent used, interestingly, by undertakers and military quartermasters alike. And here," he said, tapping lightly with a fingernail, "a scratch, fine but distinct, running perpendicular to the hinge, and certainly not in keeping with the general direction of pocket wear." He returned the watch. "Now then, Mr. Eversley," the man breathed. "Lionel Eversley. But how did you know?" Holmes merely smiled. Holmes did not reply at once, but allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to deepen the mystery. "You see, Mr. Eversley," he said at last, "the watch does not belong to you. It never did. Not in the sense that matters." Lionel Eversley's brow furrowed. "But it was left to me. My uncle, I do not question your claim of inheritance," Holmes interrupted gently, "but rather its authenticity. That scratch upon the case does not match your handling habits. Nor do the oil residues found within the clasp belong to your skin's chemistry. Yours is too dry. Moreover, the internal ticking is a fraction slower than standard, as though it had been tampered with and hastily reassembled." He leaned back in his chair. "No, Mr. Eversley, this watch has been in someone else's pocket far more recently than yours. The only question that remains," he added, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, "is why." "Mr. Holmes," the young man said, clearing his throat with effort, "my name is Lionel Eversley. I work as a clerk for Messrs. Hensley and Brougham, solicitors of Lincoln's Inn Fields." There was something curiously halting in his manner, as though the act of introduction required more courage than he presently possessed. His fingers still hovered near the watch, now resting upon the edge of Holmes's desk, as though reluctant to part from the object altogether. "I came," he continued, "because I have no one else to turn to, and because I fear that, unless something is done, I shall go mad." Holmes made no reply, but his eyes did not leave the man's face. I had seen that look before, a gaze that penetrated, not with hostility, but with surgical precision, dissecting thought, intention, and fear with merciless clarity. "My uncle, Captain Archibald Eversley, died a fortnight ago. He was not a man much spoken of in society. His habits were reclusive, but he was—" He hesitated, then added with a certain defiance, "He was honourable." The word seemed to catch in his throat. Holmes's fingers tapped once upon the desk. "You say he died, but I gather you do not consider it a simple passing." "No," Lionel said, "not simple, and certainly not finished." "My uncle was a retired officer," Lionel began, "of the Bengal cavalry. He returned from India in 1883 and settled at his estate in Surrey, Ashgrove Manor, outside Godalming. Since then, he has lived in near complete seclusion, save for his housekeeper and the occasional estate steward. Even I saw him no more than 3 or 4 times a year." "Yet you inherited his watch," Holmes observed quietly. "Yes," Lionel nodded. "It was sent to me by post, along with a brief letter written in his hand and dated the day before he died. The tone was strange, more affectionate than usual, but also anxious. He wrote only that I was to guard the watch well, for it had guarded him in turn. And then, 2 days later, I received word that he had died in his sleep." Holmes gave no outward sign of surprise, but I could tell he was now fully engaged. "Was there a physician present at the time of death?" "Dr. Marston, the village doctor, declared it a cardiac failure. The housekeeper, Miss Phelps, said he had complained of tightness in the chest, but refused to be examined." "And you accepted this conclusion?" "I tried to, until last Thursday." "Ah," Holmes murmured, "the second life of the watch." Lionel Eversley leaned forward, his voice trembling slightly. "A man threw himself from the parapet of the railway bridge near Borough. The authorities called it suicide. I would not have taken note, until I read that a golden watch was found upon his person. A watch bearing the initials AEA. Silence settled in the room. Holmes remained still, though a faint narrowing of his eyes suggested the sharpening of focus. "I went to the coroner's office," Lionel continued. "I asked to see it, and there it was. My uncle's watch, the same casing, the same initials, even the dent near the hinge, yet I still had the watch he left me. I showed it to the constable and he grew suspicious, said I must be mistaken, or worse, involved." Watson frowned. "And the man who died Was he known to you? Lionel shook his head. A drifter, they said. No fixed address. But one detail stood out. He had at one time been a soldier in the Bengal campaign. Holmes reached for the watch again, holding it to the light. 2 identical watches, one known to belong to your uncle, one in your possession, a former Bengal soldier dead under suspicious circumstances. Yes, Mr. Eversley, I begin to understand the nature of your disquiet. Lionel slumped slightly in the chair, as though the act of telling had left him drained. I don't know what to believe, he whispered. I only know this cannot be coincidence. No, Holmes said softly. It is not. I confess I felt a chill as the young man raised his eyes to us once more, their expression hovering between dread and despair. Mr. Holmes, he said, do you believe in such things as curses? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he examined the man with that cold serenity which made him, at times, seem scarcely human. No, he said finally, but I believe in the power of suggestion and in the potency of fear. Because it feels as though something is stalking me, Lionel continued. There have been strange notes left at my rooms. Once I found the watch, this watch, on the floor beside my bed, though I had locked it in a drawer the night before. I sometimes wonder if I am going mad. You are not mad, Holmes replied, but someone very much wishes you to doubt your own sanity. The room grew quiet. Only the fire stirred, casting faint flickers upon Holmes's unmoved face. The sense of design, of method within menace, was palpable. Dr. Watson, Holmes said without turning, do make a note. We shall require a visit to Surrey. Holmes rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, where he parted the curtain just enough to peer into the fog beyond. The golden watch is no ordinary timepiece, he murmured. It has become the token of an unseen hand, perhaps even a killer's signature. And that, he turned back to Lionel, is of considerable interest to me. Lionel looked at him with a mixture of confusion and hope. You believe someone murdered my uncle? I believe, Holmes said carefully, that someone feared what your uncle knew, and that the watch is a symbol in this fear, a message disguised as inheritance. He returned to his seat and steepled his fingers. There are too many peculiarities. The replication of the object, the connection to a military campaign notorious for its shadows, and now, a second corpse bearing the mark of your family. He leaned forward, his voice low and precise. I shall take your case, Mr. Eversley, but I must warn you, when one walks backward into the past, one sometimes steps upon serpents thought long dead. With that, the case was begun, and our descent into the puzzle of the golden watch had truly commenced. It was on a chill morning 3 days after Mr. Eversley's visit that Holmes and I took our seats aboard the early train to Godalming, bound for the country estate known as Ashgrove Manor. The fog, which had lingered like a sullen guest over London, gave way only grudgingly to the bare, hoar-frosted fields of the southern counties, though its presence clung faintly still to every hedge and hollow. Holmes, as was his wont during such journeys, spoke little, his brow furrowed in that inward archiving of possibilities which so often preceded a stroke of brilliance. I had, from long association, come to understand such silences and refrained from interrupting them. Though my own mind turned over the details of our curious case, the duplicate watches, the suicide, the murmured suggestion of an old betrayal. Our arrival at the small station was uneventful, though I could not help noting Holmes's swift glances at the few waiting carriages, his gaze lingering on the wheels, the drivers, the mud spatter on the spokes. As we ascended the lane toward the house, I sensed, though I could not yet explain why, that whatever truth lay hidden within the golden watch, its roots were buried deep in this frost-hardened soil. Ashgrove Manor stood as a dark sentinel amidst its overgrown grounds, its ivy-choked facade and shuttered windows, conveying not grandeur, but retreat. There was no welcoming presence upon the threshold. Instead, the door was answered only after a second knock, by a woman of rigid bearing and indeterminate age, who introduced herself as Miss Phelps. Her features were austere, her voice clipped, as though each syllable were being grudgingly surrendered. She led us through cold hallways to a drawing room that had long since surrendered any semblance of comfort. "You've come about the captain," she said without inflection. "I feared it wouldn't be long." "We are here on behalf of Mr. Lionel Eversley," Holmes replied. "You served Captain Eversley long? For 17 years. I knew his moods and silences better than any." She hesitated. "But I do not pretend to have known his secrets." Before Holmes could inquire further, a tall figure entered, clean-shaven, well-dressed, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to being listened to. He introduced himself as Roland Eversley, cousin to Lionel and, as he put it, former heir apparent. His smile was thin and did not reach his eyes. "I trust this is not some sort of sensational inquest." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "No, Mr. Eversley. It is merely a matter of time, and of what was hidden within it." It was with a sense of quiet reverence that we ascended to Captain Eversley's chambers, still untouched since the day of his death. The room bore the orderly austerity of a military man, nothing wasted, nothing out of place. And yet Holmes moved through it as a hawk circles a field, not seeking disorder, but the illusion of order poorly disguised. He paused first at the watchstand, a small wooden tray near the dressing table. "Here," he murmured, "is where it lay. Note the faint oval of dust where the watch once sat, and yet observe the clasp." He lifted a chain that hung beside it. "Newer than the rest. Replaced, I should say, within the last month. A man does not replace a chain unless the original is lost, broken, or taken." I looked about, searching for what he saw with such clarity. "Now the bed," Holmes said. He knelt and pointed. "Here, beneath the left post. Do you see it?" I crouched beside him and saw the faint gouge in the wooden frame, as though a heavy boot or heel had struck it violently. "There was a struggle," Holmes said, almost to himself. "A silent one, sudden, deliberate." He rose and moved to the writing desk, rifling through a sheaf of papers with swift, practiced hands. "His military discharge should be here," he muttered. "Captain Eversley would not have misplaced it. It has been removed." He turned to face us both, the light from the window catching the edge of his expression. "Gentlemen, this is no death by natural means. This was a silencing." Back in the drawing room, Holmes confronted Miss Phelps and Roland with a series of questions so carefully constructed that they seemed almost casual. Yet each, I knew, was a hammer blow aimed at the heart of deception. "Was there a revised will?" Holmes asked. Roland stiffened. "There was. Drawn up last year. I was replaced." "By Lionel?" He hesitated. "Yes." Miss Phelps, for her part, remained impassive, though her knuckles whitened slightly on the back of the chair she gripped. "The captain believed bloodline less important than character," she said. "He felt Mr. Lionel had more substance." Roland's laugh was brittle. "He meant pliability, madam. My uncle was not above punishing defiance." "Was there ill feeling between you?" Roland did not answer directly. "We were not close." Holmes nodded once. "Did you visit the manor in the fortnight prior to the captain's death?" "No," Miss Phelps interjected suddenly. "But someone did. I heard boots on the gravel 3 nights before. Heavy steps. I thought it a groundsman, but no one claimed the visit." Holmes folded his hands. then we must consider not merely who had the most to gain, but who feared what the captain might yet reveal. The silence that followed was dense, like the fog that pressed against the windows outside. That evening, Holmes proposed we dine at the local inn, the Red Badger, where the hearth was warm and the ale dark and stout. While I consumed a simple stew and allowed the day's impressions to settle, Holmes set about what I can only describe as a quiet hunt. He moved from barmaid to ostler, from the elderly regular in the corner to the innkeeper's daughter, weaving his questions within pleasantries, and gathering, as a spider gathers dew, those droplets of truth too light for ordinary men to perceive. It was after a whispered exchange with the landlord, Mr. Grigg, that Holmes returned to our table, his brows slightly arched. "Captain Eversley," he said, "was not without enemies, particularly one Major Henry Stansby, a former comrade from the Indian campaigns." "Enemies?" I asked. "Over what matter?" "A scandal, long buried. Rumours of misappropriated funds during the withdrawal from the Khyber garrisons. Eversley reported irregularities. Stansby was quietly dismissed from service." "And returned to England?" "Indeed, and was last seen," Holmes added calmly, "in this very village, less than a month ago." He sipped his brandy and leaned back, eyes half closed. "The past, Watson, is not merely a shadow. It is a substance, and it leaves footprints." We returned to our lodging, an austere pair of rented rooms above the grocer's, late in the evening. The wind had risen and the fog had thickened to a clammy shroud that seemed to follow us like a second presence. As I removed my coat by the hearth, Lionel, who had remained behind at Holmes's request, approached with a look of sickly pallor. "It came while you were gone," he whispered, and held out a folded slip of paper. Holmes took it and read silently. The note was brief, written in block capitals. "The watch counts down more than time." There was no signature, no seal, no indication of origin. Holmes examined the paper carefully, then held it near the lamp. Coarse paper, ink faded at the edges, written with a trembling hand, or one gloved. "It was not meant as a riddle, Watson. It is a promise." "To what end?" I asked. Holmes folded the note slowly. "To unsettle, to provoke, but more importantly, to test our reaction." He slipped the paper into his coat. "We return to London at first light. The shadow grows bolder, and shadows, as you know, are fondest of striking just before dawn. We had scarcely been back in London a full day when news reached us that struck like the report of a pistol through still air. Inspector Lestrade himself delivered it, arriving at Baker Street with the sort of urgency that bespoke more than a routine inquiry. "A man was found dead last night," he said, placing his bowler hat upon our table. "In a boarding house off Weber Street in Southwark. No sign of foul play, but—" He hesitated, eyeing Holmes. "But?" Holmes prompted softly. Lestrade drew from his coat pocket a small cloth pouch, which he unfolded to reveal a golden pocket watch. Holmes did not touch it, but leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Initials?" he asked. "A E," Lestrade confirmed. "Same as before, same placement, same dent near the hinge, found in the dead man's waistcoat pocket." "And the deceased?" "Name of Barker, Henry Barker. Formerly of the 13th Bengal Lancers, dishonourable discharge in '83. No family, no known associates." Holmes turned slowly to me. "That makes two, Watson. Two men, both once connected to Eversley, dead under suspicious circumstances, and both marked by this same timekeeping token." I felt a chill at the base of my spine. The watch, now more than ever, seemed less an heirloom and more a harbinger. And somewhere, I felt, a hand still turned its dial. Holmes and I examined the facts by firelight that evening, spread upon the table in our sitting room like pieces of a broken chronometer. The duplicate watches, the sequence of deaths. The fragile mind of Lionel Eversley caught in the noose of suggestion. There must be an explanation, I insisted, pacing the rug. The watch he received was posted to him from the estate days before Barker's death. He's had it the entire time. And yet, this second one, Holmes's fingers steepled, is identical, down to the scratch at the base of the clasp. Yet there cannot be two originals. Therefore, one must be a fabrication, a counterfeit made to deceive, though not for monetary gain. But why? To disorient, Holmes said, to create the illusion of a curse, to establish a pattern where none should exist. He rose then, moving to the hearth. The manipulation of reality, Watson, is the most potent tool in the criminal's arsenal. If I can convince you that what you hold is haunted, I need never strike a blow. He turned to me. The truth is not in the watch. It is in who placed it. The morning papers arrived with their usual rustle, but what they carried within was anything but routine. Bold headlines screamed from the front of the Star and the Evening News. The Eversley curse claims another. Death follows the golden watch. The article beneath was lurid and filled with half-truths, suggesting that Captain Eversley had dabbled in Eastern mysticism during his service, that he had brought back a cursed relic, and that the deaths of his former comrades were not chance but fate. Holmes, reading silently, handed the page to me with a look of quiet contempt. "They've made him into a character from a penny dreadful," he muttered, "and turned a pattern of murder into a ghost story." "But the damage is done," I replied grimly. "Public opinion now believes in the watch's curse. And Lionel—" Holmes nodded. "Yes, he is a sensitive man. The pressure may be intolerable." That afternoon we received 3 telegrams from different corners of the country, all from men once linked to Eversley's regiment. Each expressed alarm, and 2 refused any interview. The contagion of fear was spreading, faster than Holmes could pin it down. When next we saw Lionel Eversley, it was in a state I scarcely recognized. His coat hung off his frame. His eyes, once merely anxious, now bore the sheen of sleepless nights and creeping dread. He held the watch tightly in his hand, not as a keepsake, but as though it were the anchor of his reason. "They're dying," he whispered, "one by one, and now the papers say I'm next." Holmes said nothing at first. He took a seat across from him, observing him with a physician's detachment. "Mr. Eversley," he said finally, "fear clouds the mind. That is its first and greatest victory. But we are not here to yield to it. We are here to outwit it." Lionel shook his head. "I've received 2 more notes. One placed in my overcoat, another beneath my pillow. Always the same phrase, 'The watch counts down.' Always unsigned." I glanced at Holmes, but he offered no expression. "You must tell me, Mr. Holmes," Lionel pleaded. "Am I mad, or is there truly something hunting me?" "You are neither mad nor alone," Holmes said softly. "But you must hold your nerve. The mind is our battleground, and the hour is not yet struck." It was later that evening, as Lionel rested in the upstairs chamber of Baker Street, that I voiced a suspicion that had taken root in my own mind. "Holmes," I said, "we've been looking outward, at Barker, at the regiment, at the press. But what if the danger lies nearer?" "You refer to Roland," Holmes replied. "Yes, he loses the inheritance, gains only after Lionel's demise. What if he is the architect of this entire illusion?" Holmes lit his pipe with a match, watching the flame curl before extinguishing it. "Roland Eversley is an ambitious man, that much is certain, and his alibi for the days surrounding the captain's death is conveniently vague, but he lacks one thing." "What's that?" "Imagination," Holmes said. "This affair has required subtlety, a psychological campaign staged with precision. Roland is clever, but not creative. I frowned. Yet could he not hire such a mind? Ah, Holmes said. Now you are thinking like a detective. The architect may not wield the knife, but he draws the blueprint. He exhaled a slow plume of smoke. And every blueprint leaves a signature. The next morning, Holmes handed me a folded copy of the Illustrated London News. Note the third column, he said. A retrospective from '78. I read it aloud, the words chilling. In the closing months of the Indian Mutiny, several officers fell prey to what natives called the Whispering Death. Each discovered dead, with a golden timepiece nearby, engraved with British initials. Among the victims was Captain Forsyth, whose testimony had once threatened to expose corruption among the quartermasters. I looked up. It's the same pattern. Indeed, Holmes said. Captain Eversley may have been aware of the earlier incidents. The regimental logs confirm he was stationed near the Fort Kawara garrison in that same period. So this isn't new, I breathed. It's a continuation. Holmes nodded. A motif revived. The use of the watch as emblematic justice, or symbolic silencing. And Major Stansby? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he stared into the middle distance. Some debts, he said finally, are paid not in gold, but in fear, and some men never forget the hands that almost exposed them. In the days that followed, Holmes moved with an almost imperceptible focus. He questioned no more. He announced no new theories. Instead, he turned his attention to the peripheries, the boots of visitors, the corridors of boarding houses, the servants' entrances of clubs. On more than one occasion, I found him brushing dust from the edge of a hallway rug or inspecting a muddy footprint by gaslight. Once I observed him pocket a single spent matchstick from the floor of a stairwell, saying nothing of its presence. I dared not interrupt these silent rituals. I knew them too well. They were the signs that Holmes's mind had turned inward, its machinery humming with inference. Whatever pattern he perceived, he was not yet ready to name it. But I could see it in his eyes. The watch had ticked one step closer to revelation, and its echo would soon reach the one who feared it most. It must have been a few minutes past 2 when I was roused from sleep by an insistent rapping upon my door. Holmes's voice followed immediately after, low but urgent. "Watson, bring your coat. There's not a moment to lose." Within minutes, I had joined him in the corridor, where he was already buttoned for the chill and lighting a lantern. Without another word, we descended to the street and took a hansom toward Lionel's temporary lodgings off Montague Place, where Holmes had arranged for the young man to remain under discreet observation. When we arrived, the doorman stood pale and trembling, claiming to have smelled something foul on the upper floor. Holmes swept past him and bounded up the staircase 2 at a time. I followed closely behind. The air in the corridor above was thick and cloying, sour, metallic, and unmistakably wrong. Holmes threw open the chamber door and flung the windows wide with swift, decisive movements. I caught sight of Lionel, unconscious upon the bed, one arm slung limply over the side. "Gas," Holmes muttered. "We are not too late, but only just." And even then, I could feel the breath of death receding from the room like a retreating tide. Holmes moved with clinical speed. He retrieved a handkerchief from his breast pocket, soaked it in water from the wash basin, and placed it firmly across Lionel's nose and mouth. With my assistance, we raised him to a sitting position, fanning him steadily as the room began to clear. The hiss of escaping air from the fireplace flue caught my ear. Holmes was already there, crouched near the hearth, his fingers tracing the inner edge of the vent. He drew back and held up a thin metal rod, bent at one end and streaked with soot. "This was wedged into the damper," he said. "It prevented the chimney from venting properly. The fire drew oxygen while the gas flowed back into the room." He turned to me grimly. It was not a crude attempt, Watson. It was calculated. Lionel stirred, groaning softly, his skin pallid and damp. He opened his eyes and stared at us in confusion, then fear. "You're safe now," I told him gently. "It was gas, but you're fortunate." Holmes rose slowly. "Fortunate, yes, but not accidental. We are no longer dealing with fear-mongering alone. This was murder, only moments from consummation." It was as I turned down the bedsheet to adjust the pillow that I saw it, a glint of polished brass tucked just beneath the fabric, nestled against the mattress as though waiting to be found. I froze. "Holmes," I said, stepping back. "Look here." He came forward and knelt beside the bed. With a handkerchief, he lifted the object and examined it in the dim lamplight. It was the watch, not Lionel's copy. Holmes had personally secured that one in a locked box at Baker Street, but a second. Or perhaps, I thought with a sudden chill, a third. Its face had been reset. The hands pointed precisely to 12. Holmes turned it over and traced the familiar monogram, AE. He did not speak for a long while, only stared at the thing in his palm as though it were some talisman dredged up from the depths of an ancient tomb. "The symbolism is deliberate," he said at last. "Midnight. The end of one day, the beginning of another. Death cloaked as transition." He turned to Lionel, who now clutched the sheets with a wild look in his eyes. "The enemy has moved from suggestion to action," Holmes murmured, "and he intends the watch to be the last thing our client ever sees." Lionel's breathing grew shallow. His gaze darted from the watch in Holmes's hand to the fireplace, then to the windows, as though measuring the walls for escape. He sat upright, trembling, his words spilling forth in a rapid murmur. "It was here," he gasped. "The thing, the shadow. I heard it, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They stopped outside the door. And then, silence." Holmes leaned forward. "Did you see anyone? Hear a voice?" Lionel shook his head violently. "Number just the ticking, like it was right in my ear. I tried to stay awake, but the fumes..." He choked on the memory. "Am I mad, Mr. Holmes? Is this all in my mind?" "No," Holmes said with quiet finality. "What you've experienced is real. It is designed to appear otherwise, but it is the work of a calculating hand." Lionel looked to me with eyes that brimmed not with tears, but something more haunting, the helplessness of a man who fears the betrayal of his own reason. I grasped his arm gently. "You are not alone in this." Holmes, meanwhile, stood at the window, gazing into the blackness beyond the glass. "Our adversary," he said softly, "is growing impatient, and that is when they make mistakes." Inspector Tolliver, summoned by the landlord, arrived within the hour and took a cursory glance at the scene. His moustache bristled with disapproval, and his tone was one of faint incredulity. "Seems a bit theatrical, doesn't it?" he muttered. "The watch, the gas, the notes. You sure this fellow hasn't a taste for his own melodrama?" Holmes's expression did not change, but there was a steel in his voice I had seldom heard. "No, Inspector. This is not self-inflicted. It is a design of such intricacy that only the ignorant would mistake it for delusion." Tolliver grunted. "Very well, but keep me informed." As we stepped once more into the night, the lamps guttering against the mist, Holmes pulled his collar high and spoke in a tone that sent a tremor through me. "We are close now, Watson. Close enough that our enemy sees the need for haste." I glanced back toward the window of Lionel's chamber, the pale light within barely penetrating the thick veil of fog. "And what do you expect next?" Holmes turned his eyes toward the rooftops and the dark beyond. "Desperation," he said, "and perhaps violence. For we have trespassed upon ground the guilty thought forever buried." It was late the following evening, the rain sluicing against the windows of Baker Street in great diagonal strokes, when Holmes rose from his seat beside the hearth and placed the two watches side by side upon the table. He regarded them as a jeweller might compare rare stones, quietly, with cold precision. "You will observe, Watson," he said, "that while both bear the monogram AE, only one bears the mark of age honestly." I stepped closer and noted the faint discrepancy he indicated. The hinge of one watch bore a scratch, sharp, angled, unnatural, whereas the other's blemish had softened with the touch of time. "Also here," Holmes continued, opening the back casing, "observe the minute residue along the interior of the lid, a solution used by certain chemists to simulate oxidation, crude but passable in dim light." I took the timepiece in my hand and felt the subtle difference in weight and temperature, as though one still carried the memory of its owner, while the other remained but an echo. "It is a forgery," Holmes concluded, "crafted not to deceive the eye, but to deceive the soul. Its purpose was not theft, but confusion. Our adversary understands psychology as well as craftsmanship." I swallowed, the implications settling upon me like mist. "Few men in London," Holmes began, "possess both the audacity and discretion required to produce such an imitation without inquiry, and fewer still who would undertake the task without leaving behind the signature flaws of their hand." He withdrew a small notebook and turned to a page filled with entries in his precise angular script. "I began with the known firms, those of Bond Street and Clerkenwell, but quickly ruled them out. Their reputations rest on traceability. Instead, I focused on the independent artisans, those operating from lodgings, workshops, or in the shadow of pawnshops." He rose and fetched a small parcel from the cabinet. Unwrapping it revealed a third watch, identical in structure, yet clearly in a state of disrepair. "I procured this from a Mr. Gort in Lambeth," Holmes said, "an ex-military artificer. He repaired timepieces for officers during the Indian campaigns." Holmes opened it and gestured to the alignment of the numerals. Slightly irregular, just enough to be dismissed, unless you knew the hand that placed them. "And Gort?" I asked. "Blind in one eye. Smells of turpentine, keeps his receipts." Holmes laid a thin slip of paper upon the table. "This," he said, "was his most recent commission. Paid in cash by a man who never gave his name but wore a regimental pin of the 14th Bengal Infantry." "Watson," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming beneath the lamplight, "we must no longer wait for the next move. We must provoke it." I looked up from the note in my hand. "Provoke? How?" "With misdirection," he replied. "Let us suggest to our adversary that his machinations have worked, that Lionel, overwhelmed by fear, has been committed to an asylum, and that the police have secured the incriminating watch." I raised a brow. "Surely such a fiction cannot be easily sustained." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "truth, when laced with fear, becomes surprisingly pliable. The public is already primed to believe in curses. Let us feed them a headline." And so it was that Holmes dictated a short item for the Evening Standard, attributing it to anonymous sources within Scotland Yard. "Young heir succumbs to delusion, detained for his safety. Timepiece of interest handed to authorities." "Now," Holmes said, sealing the envelope, "we must deliver our message to the proper ears. And what of Lionel? He shall remain safely under our care, but our adversary must believe he has won. Only then will he risk showing himself. Only then," Holmes said with deliberate calm, "will he reach for the watch." That very night, Holmes assumed a disguise so convincing I nearly failed to recognize him. Gone were the tailored coat and hawk-like features. In their place stood a stooped, greying constable with calloused hands and the slow speech of a veteran night watchman. "I shall be stationed within the evidence vault at the Yard," he explained. "You, Watson, will remain here. Your absence from the ruse is crucial. Your character is too well known." It was not without anxiety that I watched him vanish into the darkness. The knowledge that he walked willingly into a trap, one we ourselves had baited, sat uneasily upon my chest. The hours that followed were among the longest of my life. I sat by the fire with the decoy watch in a locked box before me, the real one secure in Holmes's possession. Outside, the wind howled through the chimney, and every creak of the stairs sent my heart into my throat. At precisely 10 minutes to midnight, a telegram arrived, unsigned save for the mark we had come to expect, a capital S inside a crude, sketched circle. It read, "Tonight." Vaultwine stared at it for several moments before folding it with care. Holmes was not simply playing a part, he had become the bait. Later, Holmes would recount to me the events of that night in tones measured and clinical, though I detected beneath them a current of tension rarely admitted. The vault was quiet, he said, save for the ticking of a dozen clocks impounded from various cases. The watch lay within its velvet box upon the shelf marked AE, Exhibit D. I placed myself behind a stack of file crates, obscured but within 10 feet. He paused. At 11:57 I heard the door unlatch. No hesitation. No fumbling. Whoever entered had knowledge of the lock's mechanism. He described the figure as tall, cloaked with gloved hands, and a gait that bore the imprint of military discipline. He did not pause to search, Holmes said. He went directly to the box. That confirmed two things. He had been there before, and he feared we had discovered the truth. The man opened the case and removed the watch with delicate precision. He turned it over, checked the engraving, and, Holmes noted, smiled faintly, as if reacquainting himself with a long-lost weapon. I waited until he turned his back, Holmes said. Then I stepped forward and spoke his name. And he ran? I asked. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. He saluted. Holmes's voice did not waver as he recounted what followed. He stood at attention, as though awaiting a superior's command. It was not bravado, but ritual, something buried deep within the military marrow. Major Henry Stansby, Holmes said aloud, late of the Bengal Infantry, dishonourably dismissed under sealed censure. The man's eyes, cold and grey, did not flinch. You've no proof, he said. Holmes stepped closer. I have Gort's receipt, the matchstick soot from your boots at Ashgrove, and the third watch, your watch, bearing the exact flaw of your commissioned forgery. Still, Stansby held his composure. Why? Holmes asked him. Why kill Barker? Why torment the boy? Stansby's face darkened. Because the captain wouldn't stay buried, he hissed. He had notes, records of what we did. If the boy had found them... Holmes said nothing. It was not needed. I gave the man his piece, Stansby continued. He knew too much. They all did. They signed their own fates the moment they left India. Holmes turned to the officers now entering the vault. Take him, he said simply. As they led the major away, I saw something pass across his features, not fear, but resentment, as though justice were not a reckoning, but a betrayal. Major Stansby sat in the interrogation chamber of Scotland Yard, like a man long acquainted with cold rooms and colder glances. His face, weathered by sun and sin, betrayed nothing as he folded his hands upon the table before him. Two uniformed officers flanked the door. Lestrade stood to one side with his arms crossed, while Holmes took the seat opposite their captive, his expression composed but unyielding. I remained in the corner, as observer and chronicler, though my heart beat with the weight of what was to come. The lamplight flickered faintly upon the brass buttons of Stansby's coat, the same coat he had worn during his brief and disgraceful tenure in India. For several minutes there was silence. Holmes observed the man without speaking, letting the hush stretch thin as wire. At length, he said in a voice soft and deliberate, You had ample time to run, Major. And yet you did not. Stansby gave no reply. Holmes leaned forward. That is not courage. That is calculation. A soldier once, a smuggler later, a murderer always. Stansby raised his eyes then, not in defiance, but with the grim composure of a man who has played the final card in a losing hand. Holmes unfolded a single sheet of paper from his coat pocket and laid it flat upon the table. "This," he said, "is the receipt given by a Mr. Gort, a watchmaker and former artificer, for the commission of a replica golden timepiece bearing the initials A.E. The payment was made in cash by a man wearing a Bengal regimental pin." He tapped the paper lightly. "You were seen leaving Gort's shop 3 weeks ago. Gort identified you by your voice. He served under your command in Rangpur." Still, Stansby remained silent. Holmes removed a second object from his case, a matchbox. He opened it and produced 2 spent matchsticks. These were recovered from the floor of Ashgrove Manor and the boarding house in Suffolk. The sulphur tips were marked with boot grease. "Your boots, Major. Custom soles with a 1/2-inch offset to the left heel. A wound from Ballacott, I believe." Holmes leaned forward, his voice tightening. "And here," he said, setting the false watch on the table, "is the forgery you planted twice. Once on a dead man, once beneath a pillow soaked in gas. The scratches upon its hinge were made with the edge of your ring, the same ring you now wear." The Major's hands tightened briefly. Holmes did not move. "Shall I continue?" he asked. "Or shall we now discuss the truth?" For the first time, a tremor passed beneath Stansby's mask, a crack in the armour. He inhaled sharply, then let the breath fall from him like the collapse of a fortress long besieged. His voice, when it came, bore the weight of years and the ash of memory. "We ran contraband through the quartermaster's trains," he said. "Weapons, tea, opium mostly. A dozen officers were in on it. Eversley among them at first, until he found his spine." Holmes did not flinch. "And when he threatened exposure?" Stansby nodded. "He wrote to the Colonial Office, said he'd gathered enough to bring half of us before a tribunal. But before the packet could be posted, it vanished. We made sure of that." "And he left India," I said. "But you feared he might still act." "He did act," Stansby growled. "He kept records, detailed, damning. We knew he'd pass them to someone. His solicitor, perhaps, or his nephew. So I watched, waited. And when he finally moved, when he sent that cursed watch to the boy, I struck." Holmes's voice was low. "You smothered a man in his sleep. Then you poisoned another. And all to silence a truth that had waited a decade to speak." Stansby looked away. "It wasn't just truth, Holmes. It was disgrace. The end of every name we carried." He gave a bitter laugh. "So yes, I killed. To keep my rank intact." Holmes reached again for the watch, this time cradling it in his palm with almost surgical detachment. "Why the watch?" he asked quietly. "Why not fire? Or blade? Why use this object?" Stansby's jaw twitched. "Because it was his. Because it meant something. The captain carried it through every campaign, polished it every evening, like it was sacred, said it had been his father's before him, that it measured not just time, but truth." He snorted. "So I made it his epitaph, a little poetic justice." "You twisted honour into threat," I said coldly. Stansby glanced toward me. "Don't pretend he was a saint. He covered for us at first, took his cut. Only later did he grow a conscience." Holmes laid the watch upon the table and rose. "And so you turned it into a symbol, a cursed relic to mask a sequence of calculated murders." "A symbol," Stansby repeated, as though tasting the word. "Yes. Let them whisper about curses. Let them chase ghosts. I preferred that to a noose." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You may take him, but handle him as one soldier to another, not for sympathy, but because some uniforms, even when stained, must be removed with dignity. As the officers led Stansby away, Holmes stood silently, watching the slow procession until the cell door clanged shut. Only then did he turn to me and say, "Let us bring Lionel Eversley here at once. He deserves to hear from the man himself." And so we did. In the dim corridor outside the interrogation room, the young clerk listened as the truth was laid bare. Stansby, without coercion, confessed that Lionel had been a pawn, marked for collapse, not by guilt, but by design. And in that moment, I saw Lionel's shoulders straighten, not in pride, but in the slow return of a name restored. It was a pale dawn when we returned to Baker Street, the sky outside tinged with the brittle grey of a London morning still reluctant to rouse. Holmes, Lionel and I entered the sitting room without ceremony, each carrying the silence of the night's events within him like a burden. Lionel moved to the fireside and stood without speaking, his gaze fixed upon the glowing coals as though seeking within them the outline of some moral compass that had long eluded him. Holmes, meanwhile, removed his coat and gloves with characteristic precision, then sat in his accustomed chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "Now," he said softly, "let us draw the final curtain upon this matter, for though the villain is secured, the shape of the truth remains half lit, and I do not believe, Watson, that you, or our young friend here, should be left in the shadows." Lionel turned, and in his eyes I saw gratitude mingled with dread, for there are few truths more terrible than the kind that linger close to home. Holmes reached for a folder atop his desk and withdrew a single photograph, an image of Captain Eversley's bedroom taken shortly after his death. He pointed to the bedpost. "This mark here," he said, "is not incidental. The gouge beneath the frame was made not by time, but by force, a violent act, a struggle." He paused. Stansby entered that room under the guise of reconciliation. They had been corresponding after all. But when the captain refused to yield the records, when he threatened to go public regardless, Stansby acted. "He strangled him?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Smothered, most likely. The gouge suggests that Eversley resisted, wrenching the bedpost in an attempt to rise or cry out. But the Major was younger, stronger. The deed was swift." Lionel's face had gone pale. "Then my uncle was murdered, while trying to do what was right." "Exactly so," Holmes said. "And the watch, left behind, became his legacy, twisted into a warning, but meant as a sign." Holmes retrieved a folded slip of aged parchment from his drawer and passed it to Lionel with a delicacy that surprised me. "This," he said, "was the fulcrum upon which the entire affair turned." Lionel unfolded it slowly. His eyes scanned the contents, and I watched his brow furrow, then rise in astonishment. "It's his discharge," he breathed, but, annotated, in his hand. "Indeed," Holmes affirmed. "Captain Eversley retained his official papers, as many officers do, but he also used it as a personal ledger, marking dates, names, and even cryptic references to quantities of goods unaccounted for during his final months in India." I leaned closer and read over Lionel's shoulder. "Stansby, 3 crates. Kawara, January 83. No manifest." Holmes continued. He had begun constructing a quiet indictment, one that, if published or sent to the proper authorities, would have triggered formal inquiry. "And that," I said slowly, "is why he had to die." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The discharge vanished the morning after his death, presumably taken by Stansby. Fortunately, the captain had written a duplicate summary and placed it in the hidden compartment of his writing desk, which we recovered 2 days ago." He turned to Lionel. "Your uncle was no coward. He died trying to bring the truth to light." Holmes next turned his attention to the object that had haunted every corner of this case: the golden watch. He set it once more upon the table, alongside its replica. "You will recall, Watson," he said, "that it was the clasp that first betrayed it. Too new, too polished. It sang of recent manufacture amidst a frame aged by decades." He then held up a thin magnifying lens and gestured for me to examine the inside of the hinge. "Here," he said, "you will observe the maker's mark, not that of a commercial house, but a private artisan. One R.G., Reginald Gort, why I remembered the name. The Lambeth watchmaker?" Holmes nodded. Discreet, loyal, formerly an artificer for Stansby's regiment, and as fate would have it, quite fond of gin. Gort agreed to replicate the captain's watch. Unwittingly. He believed it was a sentimental gift. Only later did he grow suspicious when his client returned asking for the original to be aged more convincingly. He kept a record, Holmes smiled. A receipt, a sketch, and a sample of the aging compound, all of which he turned over when I made plain the nature of our investigation. Lionel sat back in silence, the weight of each detail slowly lifting the veil of doubt that had darkened his world. "There remained," Holmes continued, "only the matter of proving that Stansby had visited Ashgrove Manor prior to the murder, something he categorically denied. He rose and fetched a small glass vial from the mantel. Inside were several blackened matchsticks, their tips coated faintly with what appeared to be clay. These, Holmes said, were collected from the path just beyond the servants' entrance. The soil was peculiar, marled with iron deposits and unusually adhesive when damp. I suspected it might retain foreign residue." "And it did," I said, recalling Holmes's many quiet inspections. "Yes," he confirmed. "The residue on the matchsticks, carried in the treads of Stansby's boots, matched samples lifted from the estate grounds. Furthermore, the spacing of the tread indentations confirmed the limp characteristic of Stansby's war wound." "In short," I said, "he had been there all along." Holmes smiled faintly. The land remembered what the man denied. Holmes waited until the fire had died to embers before he spoke again. "There is one final thread," he said. "Roland Eversley." I started, but surely he had no part. "No hand in the crime," Holmes said, "but he knew. He explained that during his inquiries at Ashgrove, he had discovered a burnt scrap of a letter in the study grate. It bore Roland's initials and a sentence fragment. 'If you do not act, he will. The boy must not inherit.'" Holmes turned to Lionel, who sat frozen in his chair. "Your cousin did not kill your uncle, but he learned of Stansby's plan, perhaps too late to stop it, perhaps not at all inclined to. He feared obscurity, he feared your rise, and he let silence do the work of betrayal." Lionel closed his eyes, a slow breath escaping him. "He will not be prosecuted," Holmes added, "but he will live with what he chose not to say. And sometimes, Watson, that is punishment enough." The case was concluded, and though the storm outside had not yet passed, the tension within our chambers had ebbed away, replaced by the quiet aftershock that often follows the unraveling of a complex web. Holmes and I sat by the hearth, the flickering flame casting long shadows against the walls, as though mirroring the complexities of the events we had just endured. Lionel Eversley had departed some hours before, his name cleared, though the mark of his ordeal would follow him for some time. As for Major Stansby, his fate was now sealed, though I sensed that his fall would hardly satisfy the measure of justice that the captain's family had hoped for. For not all wrongs are remedied by punishment alone. I glanced at Holmes, his face half illuminated by the firelight, his eyes distant as if already turning his thoughts to another case, another puzzle yet unsolved. The weight of the night's revelation still lingered in the air, but there was a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that only Holmes could possess after a victory of such quiet magnitude. I could not help myself. The darkness we had uncovered, the lives destroyed, and the quiet cruelty that had run like a thread through the entire affair moved me deeply. "Holmes," I said, my voice carrying the weight of my thoughts, "do you believe any man is truly beyond corruption? Can any of us claim immunity to the temptations of greed, fear, or ambition?" Holmes did not immediately respond, his gaze fixed upon the flames, as though contemplating the very nature of the question itself. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady. "I believe, Watson, that it is not immunity we seek, but vigilance, the will to resist, and the courage to face the shadows within." Holmes's words hung in the air, and I found myself pondering them, as I often did after his rare moments of philosophical insight. His mind, which could unravel the most intricate mysteries, was also capable of glimpsing the deeper currents of human nature. "Honor," he continued, "is a fragile thing, Watson. It can decay when left in the shadows too long, much like the watch that became a symbol of that very decay. But truth, like the light in the darkest room, can still endure if one watches closely enough. It may flicker, it may fade, but it will never wholly vanish." He paused, his eyes narrowing in thought. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Even in the face of deception, truth survives, albeit sometimes in a different form. His words gave me pause. In that quiet room, with the fire casting its golden glow, I felt the weight of the world lifted slightly, though not without its cost. As Holmes placed the golden watch back upon the table, I could not help but reflect on its significance. What had once been a simple heirloom, a symbol of familial pride, had become so much more: a silent witness to betrayal, a cruel tool in a murderer's hands, and ultimately, a marker of justice served. I looked at the watch one final time and saw it for what it truly was. Not just an object of time, but a testament to the fragile balance between honor and corruption, between light and shadow. In the end, the watch had fulfilled its purpose, not in the way its makers intended, but in a far more profound way. As I sat beside Holmes, the fire casting flickering shadows on his face, I asked, "Holmes, what drives a man to such lengths of deception? What makes him think he can get away with it?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the smouldering coals. "It is not the conviction that they will succeed, Watson, but the belief that they can evade the consequences. The greatest mistake a criminal can make is underestimating the persistence of truth. It waits patiently, knowing that, no matter how much we try to bury it, it will always resurface." I pondered his words, feeling the weight of our investigations settle into a quiet finality. As you reflect on the case, I wonder, what do you think was Major Stansby's biggest mistake? Was it his underestimation of Holmes, or perhaps his overconfidence in the power of fear? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling Sherlock Holmes adventures and share this tale with your friends. The mystery has been solved, but the questions linger, as they always do.